Phantasy Star is one of the most historically important RPG franchises of all time. It's a pioneer in the industry that started in 1987, and today, guess what? It is still going, but only in Japan. It's been almost 10 years since we got the last game, and there's not have been anything else localized from it. So what the hell's going on? What the hell happened to Phantasy Star? Today, we're gonna find out what. Phantasy Star was developed by Sega and one of its divisions called Sonic Team, popular obviously for the Sonic games. Yuji Naka was involved in both franchises as a programmer, although back then they were just mere projects. It all began because Nintendo had Dragon Quest, and it had gotten so popular that Sega needed a major RPG of its own for their own console, the Master System, to compete. So along with designer Kotaro Hayashida and artist Rieko Kodama, they released Phantasy Star by the end of 1987 on December 20. The following year it was localized to North America and the UK, even reaching Brazil in 1991 as the first RPG translated to Portuguese. It was a commercial success, praised for its futuristic environment with space travel and its three-dimensional dungeons, with a woman as a protagonist being one of the very first female lead characters ever in a video game. Phantasy Star was critically acclaimed, and it is considered as one of the pioneers on the genre, on par with Dragon Quest, known as Dragon Warrior in North America back then. The game was so iconic, graphically superior to Dragon Quest, that it quickly gave Sega the opportunity to create a whole franchise with the same name. In 1988, the Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis, came out, and 1 year later, Phantasy Star 2 was released for it. The game took place 1,000 years after the first one, now focusing on a different cast of characters in a different conflict, but still dragging certain issues from the past. Instead of navigating in first person through dungeons, the game now used a top-down perspective, now a third-person view for its turn-based battles. Once again, Sega met commercial success. Phantasy Star 2 was critically acclaimed, and it quickly became a classic RPG from the late 80s, being the first RPG for the system at the time. Praises went to its soundtrack, its gameplay mechanics, and its story revolving around a futuristic problem about a malfunctioning network leading to climate changes, similar to what we're starting to experience in reality nowadays. Phantasy Star 3: Generations of Doom was released in 1990 in Japan and the next year in North America and the UK. The game revolved around 3 generations of characters, and it was now in a medieval fantasy setting, not quite science fiction anymore. Also, new people developed the game, and not the original creators, with the exception of Yuji Naka, who stayed as a main producer. It felt so different than its predecessors, still with similar gameplay mechanics and all, but with a lot of technical problems, such as the game being rushed within less than a year and data storage limitations of the cartridge. Phantasy Star 3 was still praised despite its drastic changes in art style and linear storytelling, but it didn't do as well as both its predecessors. Sega wasn't worried, however, already planning yet another title in the series, also for the Genesis, a game that will become the epitome of the franchise and one of the best JRPGs of its generation. But before we get into that, there's a couple of things to cover that don't exactly influence the outcome of the series, but still worthy of mention. Given the franchise's success, spin-offs began development. Sega's portable system, the Game Gear, already competing with Nintendo's Game Boy, met two Phantasy Star titles. The first one, Phantasy Star Gaiden, was a spin-off of the original Phantasy Star, taking place on a colony founded 400 years ago by Alice, the original protagonist. This title was released only in Japan in 1992, almost 2 years later after the third Phantasy Star had been published. Then, another spin-off was made, called Phantasy Star Adventure, also for the Game Gear, taking place at the same time as Phantasy Star 2, but now being a puzzle in first person. So as you can see, Phantasy Star was a huge thing back in the early 90s, meeting success all over the place. And that is the reason why Sega wasn't worried one bit about Phantasy Star 3 not having been as successful as the others, which was also the reason why they decided to develop and release in 1993 the masterpiece Phantasy Star 4 End of the Millennium for the Genesis. It wasn't released in the US, however, until more than a year later in 1995, and by the end of it in Europe. The game was the conclusion to the entire all-goal system of the franchise's universe, taking place 1000 years after Phantasy Star 2. That's right, not 3, 2. It included manga-style panels to tell parts of the story, and a very long script that surpassed all its predecessors. Rieko Kokudama was back, now as a director, but Yuji Naka was nowhere to be found. Overall, it was an amazing game. The best in the entire tetralogy in my opinion, but unfortunately, the game met mixed reviews when it first came out. Critics complained about the music, which was extremely good by the way, also complained about the story, which was also highly substantial, and that the graphics were mediocre and outdated, which as you can see, are also awesome. So yep, mostly thanks to very idiotic people, reception was fairly positive, but not as much as the first two games in the franchise. Nevertheless, this will be the last time the world will see a turn-based Phantasy Star game, or even any title whatsoever, for over 5 years straight. Despite the series' disappearance for a while, ports started being released here and there, such as Phantasy Star Collection for the Saturn in 1998, including the first 4 main titles. It would later be ported to the Game Boy Advance in 2002, but excluding the 4th game in the series. A grave mistake, but still meeting positive reviews. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the year 2000, Sega was preparing for the series' comeback into something that will change the online gaming industry forever. We all know the company was already sinking with tons of economical issues, mainly thanks to more competition in the market such as the PlayStation, and with the Dreamcast system trying to stay afloat. So by the end of the year 2000, Sega launched Phantasy Star Online. It was the first online RPG for gaming consoles, not a turn-based RPG, but rather an action one with a story completely unrelated to the previous titles. And obviously, it was a huge success in the entire world. Marketing was taken to a whole new different level to make players engage more deeply in its online features. It quickly became one of the most important MMORPGs in the history of gaming and a pioneer of sorts of home consoles. With its success, people were slightly oblivious of the original turn-based series, moving on to the world of action RPGs. And even after the Dreamcast died, with Sega going bankrupt, Phantasy Star Online was still rolling. Ported to the GameCube, ported to the Xbox, ported to Windows, a second version released initially for the Dreamcast before its demise. There was even a second episode released for all these consoles, and a third one as well, as an exclusive for the GameCube in 2003, localized in 2004 to North America and Europe. This one, however, was extremely different than all the other online games, being a turn-based RPG with a card battle playing system. It was a good game, but players kind of ignored it, considering it had been released as a GameCube exclusive and with gameplay mechanics that were considerably different from the online classics. Such is the reason why Sega, now being a free publisher with no console of its own, took the series away from Nintendo and moved to the Xbox 360, PC and the PlayStation 2 in 2006 with an entirely new series. Phantasy Star Universe came out worldwide in 2006. The first thing everyone noticed was how different it was from Phantasy Star Online, even though it had been made by the same team and even though it was still an action RPG with both a full offline story and an online mode. It was a great game, but veteran players felt it was boring, different in a bad sense, an update to online that wasn't just nearly as good. Still a commercial success, however, and even with a direct sequel called Ambition of the Illuminus that was released the following year, although obscure due to other great titles for the PS2 being successful at the same time. Ambition, in my opinion, is a hidden gem, as good as the original, but many people didn't see it that way. They wanted a follow-up to Online or a return to the turn-based original series. So Sega attempted to satisfy everyone at once, including young people, returning to Nintendo after several years of having left it. Phantasy Star Zero was then released by the end of 2008, a game that mixed elements from both online and universe franchises, mainly an experiment to approach the younger audiences and an excuse to expand the franchise to all available video game companies. However, the game did not do very well, with mixed reviews from both players and critics. Nevertheless, Sega had already moved on to the PSP to produce yet another sequel to the Universe series called Phantasy Star Portable that same year, although the rest of the world didn't get it until 2009 and 10, just like with Phantasy Star Zero. But that same year, Japan was already releasing a fourth sequel, taking place 3 years later, story-wise, also for the PSP. Both games being an exclusive. The rest of the world got it almost 1 year later in 2010, and that was the last time we will get anything from the franchise. The series continued on in Japan with an expansion called Infinity for this last game in 2011, but it was never localized to any other country. The next year, in 2012, Japanese fans were finally happy to play Phantasy Star Online 2, initially only for PC. In 2013, it was released for the Vita, in 2014 for Android and iOS, in 2016 for the PS4, finally in 2018 for the Switch. All this only in Japan. Nobody else has gotten a localized version of this game. No one. And if we go back to 2014, Sega released Phantasy Star Nova for the PS Vita as an exclusive that we didn't get either. Wanna know who made this game? Sega? Haha. Sonic Team? Nope. It was Tri-Ace, the same people who developed the Valkyrie Profile and Star Ocean series. What the hell? An action RPG, very much like Online and Universe, but with its own unique characteristics. It was a commercial success in Japan, but still no plans were made to release it to the rest of the world. It's 2018, and the franchise is still somewhat successful in Japan, but for everybody else, it's been 8 years since the last game. No apparent intentions are there to bring out any of their last games, not even to North America. So what the hell happened to it? Why didn't we get them? Was it because sales weren't as good for the Universe franchise as they were for the Genesis games or the online versions? It's time for it to make a proper comeback. The Shining series returned very recently with Shining Resonance Refrain, so why not localize Nova or release a new game in an attempt to revive the franchise outside Japan? This is one of the most iconic video game series in the history of gaming. Over 30 years after the first game for the Master System, RPGs that revolutionized the genre and the industry. How can something so important stay only inside Japan? So here's what happened, in my opinion. Sega had an extremely important and successful tetralogy of games with a perfect closure. Then they disappeared for several years until finally returning with the online breakthrough. They exploited that and took advantage of its success, but ultimately decided to change for a second time the series. Universe was resented by online veterans and was not up to their standards. Sega, however, exploited again what little success it had and spent resources creating sequels that were great, but not according to players and critics outside Japan. So the way I see things, and I don't want to blame anybody, the reason why Phantasy Star hasn't yet returned is because people practically asked for it. They didn't support the franchise when it needed it the most, and if we take into consideration Sega's financial situation of the past few years, the answer might be a little obvious. However, if they wanted to forget about the Universe saga and bring back the online one to satisfy those asshole veterans, why not release it outside Japan? That is a question that I will sure like to hear your thoughts about in the comment section below. We may not know Sega's real reason for their latest decisions, but at least today we have an idea on what the hell happened to Phantasy Star. Well, that was a huge, long history about Phantasy Star. As you saw, it's extremely important, and I can't believe that currently it's only in Japan. For the past 8 years we have heard nothing about it. That's so sad. But let's hope that one day Phantasy Star makes a comeback, which I'm pretty sure it will one way or another. I mean, in Shining cooled, why not Phantasy Star, right? Let us not lose hope. That's it guys for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. See you next time.